It seems an age since we were last together. Still using Teams to get through the process, which has served us well so far. I just thought quick confirmation of who's on the call just for the record. So stop that noise that's happening in my office. Do that. So clearly there's myself and Commissioner Ray, and in the council office is Julia Brown and Sue Smith and David Whitney. Ms. Everly, can I get you to confirm who from your team is there? I know we can see them just for the record more than anything else.
Good morning. So myself, Tony Milne, Reese Hill and Brett Giddens, and then also a number of participants who are dialing in who are part of the applicant group but won't be speaking today.
Just to make sure they got the right, also I got Neil McDonald there, Ian Ware, Paul Croft and Kirsty Alexandra, so they're all part of the applicants team that are listening in on proceedings. In other words, they're in the public gallery as such.
That's correct.
Cool, thank you. Right, thanks for that. I just thought I'd just do a quick, Hort New Zealand aren't appearing, so they've got evidence that they have filed it, but they're not appearing. Also, the Residents for Responsible Development have confirmed they're not appearing. Alan Mackay said he's not appearing, and Rockburn Wines has said they're not appearing. So there's not we're not hearing from them, and the only evidence we have got is that from NZTA, who are appearing, and Hort New Zealand. Sorry, yes. So has anybody got anything to the contrary of that? I got that about right.
Yeah.
Good.
I
guess what we are now is this is basically which flowed out of the commissioners made 3 minute 5. I'm not going to go and bore you with all of that because everybody's pretty well aware of that. So that's why we're today. Commissioner Ray, just checking, is there anything in particular that I need to make sure we cover off before we start, or are I think we're pretty good, aren't we?
I think we're okay with that. Yes, I don't think if anyone's got any issues or procedural questions, but I think everything's been pretty well covered by minutes between commissioners who sent minutes out to the parties, and unless anything comes up right now, I think we just proceed. Yep.
If I may, Commissioners, I'd just like to remind everybody that we are recording this hearing today, and it will be available on the website later, so just to let you know it is being recorded.
Excellent. Thank you. I shall be the model of behaviour. So firstly, thanks everybody for their patience and tolerance, and for giving us the information that we have requested as we work through this process. It's been long and complex. Some parties have been a bit concerned by that. They've expressed those concerns, and as commissioners, we've said, well, we think the process has actually worked very well. It's taken some time, but at the end of the day, to get an appropriate decision, the information that we've received has been very helpful towards that. So I want to thank everybody for their patience for this, particularly the applicant. I guess it must be frustrating for them. It's probably sounds like it's gone on forever, but I guess that's seems to be something in the COVID world that seems to be happening at the moment. Things have gone on forever. So with that, I don't think I've got anything else to say. One thing I will say is that it will be helpful, Ms. Everly, for us to probably be referred to some documents and have the right plans in front of us. So if in your evidence that's being presented by your submitters, if they, your experts, sorry, if they could just sort of guide us to the right documents, that would be really helpful. As Commissioner Ray said, we've got a few. Yep. And I've worked out that next time I build a house, I'm going to make a bigger office because this one ain't big enough.
Yes, absolutely, and I appreciate there's a lot of versions to keep on top of as well. So we'll endeavour to point you in the right direction as we go.
Okay, we'll hand over to you then. Thanks.
So I have filed legal submissions dated the 16th of September, and I'm anticipating that you have read those and don't want me to take you through them line by line. Is that correct?
If I recall, Ms. Everly, the more summary statements about the evidence and the changes made to the document, and if that's the case, probably no need to dwell on those. No.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so there's not particular legal points sort of arising out of there. Probably just a couple of points that I'd like to draw your attention to before I hand over to witnesses, or see if you have any questions of me. In the introduction, I set out the rationale for the most recent changes to the structure plan. There's really 4 of those. The first is to better align with the policy and address effects on productive land by introducing the new Rural Lifestyle Area 6, which has the minimum lot size of 4 hectares. And I just note that the size, shape and minimum lot size for that area has been developed with the input of R4 RDC to be conducive to productive use. Secondly, to mitigate potential reverse sensitivity effects by locating more of the proposed dwellings further from the adjacent land uses. I noted in the Hort NZ evidence, Ms McClung states that their main concern remains the ability of established growing operations to continue to lawfully operate. I think that was addressed in previous stages of the hearing, and aside from Mr Giddens' summary of that in his most recent evidence, we haven't touched on that again. And I also note that the Hort NZ evidence doesn't further address that reverse sensitivity for established operations. Thirdly, to retain the yield for rural lifestyle lots, and finally, to confirm provision of an underpass for pedestrians and cyclists across State Highway 6. And we've seen the further evidence from Ms McMinn, and the applicant confirms that it agrees with the further amendment that she proposes in her evidence, which is the deletion of "or formal crossing point." That's at paragraph 13 of her evidence. So the provision would just relate, to provision of an underpass under State Highway 6.
Right.
I go on to summarise each of the evidence, the further statements, and I won't take you through that. Just in terms of Mr Mills' evidence, I draw your attention to the fact that he has recommended that the amenity edge along Reconvened Road be reinstated. So that was taken out in the updated structure plan. So the applicant agrees to inclusion of that, and in reply, I will file a final version that tidies up all these final amendments. In relation to soils, at paragraph 7 to 10, I've summarised Mr Hill's approach and also the weight to be given to the Macintosh report. Having read the Hort NZ evidence, my submission on those points remain and are unchanged. I'll make a couple of further points about the Hort NZ evidence. Firstly, it appears that Ms Wolf has maybe misinterpreted the approach that Mr Hill was taking. She suggests that he questions the validity and legitimacy of the operative RPS definition of high-class soils. That's not what he's intending to do. He's intending to look at the available evidence and to apply that to the RPS definition. He's also not seeking to apply a nationally consistent definition of high-class soils, which seems to be what Ms Wolf is suggesting that he's trying to do. Further, in relation to the operative RPS, I note that Ms Wolf states that the Macintosh and the operative RPS definitions are the same, and that's not correct. The operative RPS definition includes additional direction that high-class soils do not include areas that may be suited to 1 or 2 specialist crops, largely due to the climate rather than the soil quality. That's identified in Mr Gibson's evidence, but he addresses whether that he thinks the crops are specialist crops based on his own interpretation of what specialist means. I don't see that he considers whether the crops are suited to the area largely due to climate rather than soil quality. And for those reasons, I suggest that the evidence of Mr Hill and Mr Gibson around interpretation of the operative RPS should be preferred. At paragraph 11, I touch on the proposed RPS. And again, just in terms of Ms. Wharf's statement, she suggests that you should be looking at the council decision version, and that the version approved by consent order by the Environment Court has no weight. I disagree with that. I think the Environment Court consent order has confirmed the changes to the proposed RPS. Those are beyond challenge, and that's the version of that provision that you should be referring to, and that's the version that Mr. Giddens has referred to. At paragraph 12, I comment that Plan Change 14 has significant benefits in ensuring that productive use of 29 hectares of the site for the specialist cherry crop suited to that location is confirmed, and note that those benefits aren't guaranteed by retention of the status quo rural resource area. I also note that the revised structure plan provides for the additional 13.7 hectares of RLA 6 density, and that Mr. Hill finds that makes the best use of the large contiguous area of suitable soils. It avoids modified areas, and it avoids areas within the stormwater flow path. In respect to planning and the section 42A report response, there's nothing particularly that I want to further draw your attention to there. And so in conclusion, I note that consistent with the approach that the applicant has taken throughout this process, it's engaged in meaningful consultation with the community and the submitters, and has sought to address the concerns that they have raised. As a result, we've now resolved the concerns of R4 RDC and NZTA Waka Kotahi, and that the technical assessments of the amendments proposed conclude that the revised structure plan represents a better effects outcome and is better aligned with the relevant policy. Those are the particular points I wanted to draw your attention to at this stage.
Thank you, Ms. Everly. I think I've got no questions out of that. Obviously, there will be some for the witnesses as they go through, and there might be some mop up at the end. And I'm picking that we'll get to the stage today that there will be probably a verbal closing, but I'm picking your final closing will be in writing.
That's right. I intend to close in writing. Yeah, there's obviously a lot to be collected over a number of stages of the hearing to draw that together. So I prefer to do that in writing. I think that'll be more useful for you as well.
Thank you, and you're 100% correct. I'm sure it will be. Commissioner Ray, you got anything you want to ask at this point?
No, I agree with you, sir. I'm likely to come back at the end for a mop up at the end with those legal points. Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks. Okay. Then I will hand you over to Mr. Milne.
Okay.
Mr. Milne, how are you?
Very good, thanks. And yourselves?
Fantastic. As I said, might be useful if there's some documents you want to point us to, because I guess this information was back in July in particular, and it's as much as I've sat there and looked at it all, you might have to just point us in the right direction, and we'll certainly have some questions as we go through. So leave it in your hands as to how you take us through it.
Yeah, for sure. And I certainly have a large ring binder of documents here, and trying to get them in some sort of order is interesting as well. I assume, or I take it, that you have both read my written responses to minute 5 in response to the request for an assessment on the roading as shown on the structure plan, and perhaps future roading that might take place on site, as well as my written response in terms of the preparation of the aerial simulation of one form of the development, as well as 3 accompanying visual simulations of that form of the development, and also my supplementary evidence. I'll jump onto that in a minute, but what I was thinking was, is it useful for me to drag up, or not drag up, but talk to the structure plan revision B, which is the most up-to-date one, and also just to talk you through the aerial representation and the visual simulation. So we talk to those graphics, and perhaps in talking to those graphics, we answer some of the questions you have and cover off a number of the points that I've made in my supplementary evidence. Would that make sense?
Yeah, that would be very helpful. As I say, back in July, it was probably something we were pretty familiar with, and the subsequent discussions we've had. But it's been a long time since then, and I think it will be quite helpful.
Fantastic. Okay, so if we turn to structure plan, or the most up-to-date structure plan, that's labelled Plan Change 14 Structure Plan Revision B, 16th of September 2020. Sure, that was appended to
To my legal submissions, I think.
Oh, okay. Yep, I've got it.
Just let me know when you've got that up and in front of you. And
yes, I have it. Yep.
And I'm not sure how easy it is for you to also have the structure plan, as we discussed at the hearing, adjacent to that on your screens, but not imperative that you have, because I can talk through those changes as clearly as I can.
I can do both. So I've got the structure plan, and what's the other plan you want to refer to? Sorry.
The structure plan that we tabled at the hearing and discussed at the hearing, at the original hearing.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Cool. I'm all right with that.
Because the key things really for me to discuss and point out to you is the new area of LA6, which has been introduced. So is it okay if I head into discussing that now? You've got that on your screens?
Yes.
Thank you.
So on the previously or tabled structure plan, we had an area of LA4 running alongside Reconvened Road and returning in a northwards direction alongside the proposed horticulture block. That LA4 now has been replaced with a zone called LA6 with a minimum lot size of 4 hectares. And as Ms. Everly mentioned before, it is some 13 hectares in size, or just over 13 hectares in size. Now that LA6 now extends to the internal road shown on the structure plan, and that replaces an area, as I said, LA4 and LA3, as well as in some area of LA2. This allows for a greater area of productive use and use of those laying as soils adjacent to Reconvened Road. It does not preclude obviously building associated with that productive use, and at a minimum lot size of 4 hectares, one could imagine there would be 3 or so lots carved out of that LA6 zone. I have just got a reminder on the screen that we're in an RM team meeting, so Sarah will just quickly dismiss that. Thank you. So we have a new zone there of LA6 adjacent Reconvened Road, and important to mention, and Mr. Whitney comments on this in his supplementary evidence in response about the amenity edge along Reconvened Road. I'd just like to confirm, and as Ms. Everly has said as well, that on my suggestion should be retained. However, a length of the horticulture block amenity edge has been removed from the boundary of the horticulture block, and this is the length that was previously shown between the horticulture block and RLA4. With that RLA4 now being replaced by RLA6, there seems to be very little point from a landscape and visual point of view that one would continue that an amenity edge between 2 blocks of productive use. Now, I trust that makes sense. RLA1 has been extended to include all of the area within the loop of the internal road shown on the structure plan. That is some 10.6 hectares in site. Sorry, the RLA area is some 10.6 hectares in area. And that skirts around and fringes the open space corridor running through the through the middle. In considering the indicative master plan that we prepared to inform the visual simulations and the aerial representation, there is 58 lots shown within that area. 39 of those open directly out onto that open space zone. A section of RLA1 now lies between that internal road and the horticulture block. So that replaces an area of previously shown RLA3. And with the reduction of RLA2 between the internal road and Reconvened Road, we have tested an area and decided on a number of fronts, but in my area of expertise, landscape and visual, that an area of RLA2 could be positioned between the internal road on the structure plan, shown on the structure plan, and the area of RLA3 that lies at the start of or at the front of the SAL land, the land with the SAL overlay. An area of RLA2 in that area provides, from a landscape point of view, a nice transition between the RLA1 within the loop road and the RLA3 to the other side of it. So when one thinks about the landscape and the gradation of development over a landscape, that provides a nice transition. Just for your reference, that would result in having gone through that indicative master plan exercise. And I just want to reiterate at this stage that that master plan is only one outcome of this structure plan. There would be a number of ways that that land could be further developed as guided by the structure plan. But that is the way we have chosen to use for the visual simulations and aerial representation. But taking that master plan, what an area of RLA2 above the internal road and between RLA3 would provide an additional 8 lots within that area of land as compared to what we would have realised, or what would have been realised, I should say, under RLA3. Now,
just on that, Mr. Milne, can I ask a question now, if you don't mind? With those 8 additional lots, how do they relate to the SAL? Just so I've got that clear.
Yeah, they all lie outside of the SAL.
Okay, thank you.
SAL approximately follows the 310 metre contour.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and they lie below.
Very good, thank you.
In terms of the structure plan, there have been no other changes. So sing out if you need some further clarification in regard to those spatial changes as shown on the structure plan.
Just wonder if it might pay to just go through those numbers that you went through with the changes shown in your master plan, just to make sure we've got that clear.
Yes, for sure. So if shown on the master plan, and if we refer to the master plan, I'll run through the numbers for all of the RLA areas. Does that make sense now? Would that help?
That would be helpful, I think, yes.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but as per the master plan we've prepared, which is only one possible outcome, the RLA area with a minimum lot size of 2,000 square metres would realise, or potentially realise, 53 lots. RLA2 at a 3,000 square metre minimum lot size, 25. RLA3 with a 4,000 square metre minimum, 33. RLA4 at a 1 hectare minimum lot size, 18. RLA5 with a minimum lot size 3 hectares, 18. And RLA6, minimum lot size of 4 hectares, 3. And just to reiterate,
325 53, 18, 18, 3.
Yeah. Did you want the relevant sort of areas in hectares for those areas as well?
Wouldn't do any harm, just to make sure. I'm not saying.
I think it's really useful from a landscape point of view, because when you look at those numbers, I'll run through the hectares first and then I can talk to that. So RLA1, approximately 10.6 hectares. RLA2, approximately 7.5. RLA3, 13.2. RLA4, 18. RLA5, 54. And LA6, 13.9, I think it was. 13.7, sorry. And we obviously have the 29 hectares of horticulture blocks sitting to one side as well. So it just shows that RLA4 and 5, when you combine those, quick maths, 72 odd hectares of the site in those RLA4 and 5, which is over the SAL land. And I think it just reiterates that this is very much, from a landscape point of view, a comprehensively designed, or a structure plan that's been comprehensively designed, taking into account the landscape and the greater concentration of rural living being in those areas that can absorb it.
Just can I have a question now, please, Mr. Mill, just while we're on that structure plan, the Residents for Responsible Development, we heard that you had had some discussions with them that resulted in, well, that was the main drive, I understand, for the RLA6 and possibly some of the other changes. I saw a letter from James Gardner Hopkins where he said that the submitter actually requested further changes, but they weren't palatable, but in any event they were satisfied overall with the changes that were made. I just wanted to understand what those changes were that they were seeking. I understand they wanted more of the smaller units to become productive, or to be potentially productive on the flatter land. I'm just not sure how that relates to the structure plan that we've got now, or what those changes were. Are you able to comment on what it was they wanted there?
Commissioner Ray, I'm going to have to apologise and say no, I can't, and that would be a question I have to defer to Ms. Everly and Mr. Giddens. I wasn't part of the face-to-face consultation. Ms. Everly was just
around
to cheer around to join me.
And so I've addressed that in the memorandum of the 24th of July, which was the response to minute 5. And it talks at paragraph 4 about they remained of the view that potentially there could be more use of the flatter land for productive uses by pushing the built form, the additional lots, further up up the hillside. And I've set out there a number of reasons as to why the applicant didn't agree that that was an appropriate approach in this case.
So from a landscape point of view, as I understand that, it would mean a greater impact by pushing further to built development further up the slopes. Is that right, Mr. Mills?
Yes, that is right. I did have input into that, and particularly, yeah, yes, indeed.
All right, thanks for that. That's useful to understand that again. Thank you.
Shall we turn our attention to the aerial representation and the visual simulations?
Yeah, before you do that, can I just clarify one thing? The change in the structure plan that's come through since the July evidence has simply just re-established that planting block. Was that about the extent of that, or just make sure I've got that clear in my head?
Yes, that is correct, Commissioner.
Otherwise, the other Appendix 3 is unchanged, which was Appendix 3 was the master plan concept.
Yes, correct.
Cool, that's right, and that's got those numbers on as well. Sorry, it's got the same numbers you read out, so I'm sorry.
Which is great to see that I have been consistent.
Well, it adds up even, yes.
Yeah, that's not crikey. That's great. shall we look at the visual or the aerial representation, the visual simulations?
Yes. Yes.
And this was the package that came through in July as well. And minute 5, and I think we'd even discussed at the previous hearing about the preparation of an aerial visual representation. And at that time, you would have heard my misgivings about doing such in terms of assessing effects, and I still have those. I think it's very useful to understand the extent of the development in terms of an aerial perspective. But the caveat with that is it is a view that isn't often got from the public. It's to those that are flying above it. And yes, I have probably crossed the site 4 times in the last couple of weeks on flights to and from Queenstown. And you certainly get appreciation of the site from above. But you also get the appreciation of the wider landscape context as well, and you'd see it in that sphere. But in saying that, it is we have prepared the aerial representation here based on the master plan, and that gives you an aerial perspective of the extent of the development within the requester's land. It might be useful for me to just discuss, because you'll probably say, what has led you to using this house type and the vegetation form and things like that. And so we've obviously had to take an educated guess looking at how other areas might have developed. We've used 5 to 6 different house types, ones that we're familiar with within the area. And we've obviously modelled those houses at the heights as per the proposed rules within the plan change. And so the houses are shown at 7.5 metres, or not all of them, but some at 7.5 metres in the RLA 1 to 3 zones, 5.5 in the LA 4, and to 5 metres in the LA 5 zone, and the 3 sort of sheds, or the 3 sheds shown in the LA 6 have been modelled at 6.5 metres in height to represent perhaps a packing shed or a sorting shed or something similar to that. The trees have been modelled after 10 years of growth, and I suppose of importance to note there is that we've shown a variation of around about 4.5 to 9 metres in height of the different trees throughout the development. Hedges have been shown around about 2.5 to 3 metres, given a bit of variability, because obviously people plant different things. As long as they follow the planting lists, that is okay. And the amenity edge trees along Reconvened Road have been shown at 7 metres in height. Excuse me. And the vines depicted in the RLA 6 area have been shown at 2 metres in height. So there goes just a wee bit of technical stuff around the composition of the aerial representation and also the visual simulations. The site was visited post-hearing. Photos were taken. We selected three of the existing viewpoints, or 3 of the previously used viewpoints. One to represent a relatively close view looking across the site, a medium view, and a slightly longer view. So they were those previous viewpoints 12, 14 and 16. And now I'm referring to the visual simulations, the following 3 visual simulations in that package. Chose those viewpoints because I believe they were the most representative. They gave a very good indication of potential effects in those distances. Mr. Whitney did suggest that it was a shame that I didn't choose viewpoint 15, which was the intersection on the highway. I understand his view on that. I chose 16 because it was adjacent to the property or the dwelling of Mr. Alan Mackay, who was one of the signatories, and I thought that was a fairly representative viewpoint from the highway as well. And I also thought 14 from the racecourse provided actually perhaps a clearer view of the site than 15 did. So that were the reasons 12, 14 and 16 were chosen. One must bear in mind that those photos were taken in winter, So while the vegetation in the simulations is shown with the leaves, the receiving environment trees, or the trees that are growing there now, are deciduous. So one needs to also imagine those in leaf. And I suppose that's what's one of the wonderful things about the seasonality of Central Otago, in particular in the Lakes District, is the changing foliage on trees and the changing colours. So it can be a vibrant landscape. But these reflect one moment in time. So that was the methodology behind. If you had any questions regarding those simulations, then I can answer those now.
Yeah, Mr. Milne, I guess one of the observations I'd make is that viewpoint 15 from the McNulty Road intersection was probably the one that to me in particular probably gave the most representative view that people are likely to see quite a bit of, and along that straight as they're travelling towards Wanaka past that intersection.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think it would have been useful. I understand and respect your views, and I note also your observation about the photos being taken in winter. And if you go and look there today, it's looking quite different, obviously.
Yes.
Now, in your visual simulation, the block of pine trees is subsequently gone. They are no longer there.
Yes. Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Understand, and I was made aware of that. They were felled. After these photos were taken.
Yeah. And I guess I'm just trying to get my picture around that. So that area would sit in the RLA 5, isn't it?
That is correct. Yes,
yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in your visual simulation, because I'm looking at that particular area, am I right to assume I can see a track going up on the, if you like, the west side of those pine trees into it? And is that a building you've inserted in there?
Yes, indeed. And so that is on the master plan. We've shown an indicative road which follows that existing track through that west gully. And there are indeed, or potentially could be, 4 to 5 sections in that saddle, I suppose, at the top end of that west gully there.
I have no comment to make about other than make sure that's what I thought. I thought that's what I was seeing. I want to make sure I wasn't making it up and just assuming that's what it was. So no, that's helpful. Thank you.
And certainly respect your comments in regard to viewpoint 15 as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't have anything else in particular in respect to the simulations. Commissioner Ray, I expect you will have.
Yes, thank you. I found it really useful, Mr. Milne, to produce that bird's eye perspective. I take your point, your point that it can only be seen from the air, obviously, but it did assist with how everything fits together, so that when we're looking at individual viewpoints, we can sort of imagine what's in behind there, and it sort of it increases our understanding, at least. So thank you for doing that. Just in relation to the 8 additional smaller units, lots rather, that are being proposed for the Farmland Terrace area. Can you just take us through? I have read your evidence, but can you just sort of recap on your opinion as to why that won't have more than a minor incremental effect, if you like, from the previous plan? Just take us through if you don't mind. Yeah. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Mr. Milne, before you do, can I just ask people to wait for 30 seconds? I just need to pop from this room and do a wee task.
Okay. That is fine, Commissioner Gillespie.
All good. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Just had to get my water bottle. It was getting too hot.
If I recall last time, Commissioner Gillespie, when you were questioning me, you took time to sort the dog. So that's absolutely fine.
Believe me, that could still happen yet. Don't worry.
Absolutely fine. Commissioner Ray, turning back attention to your question. It's an increase of eight lots over what could have been realised under the previous LA3 of that land. And I think from all viewpoints, fairly hard to appreciate an increase, I suppose, in density over that land. It's a land that we would we've termed the Farmland Terrace, which is an extension of that farmland basin landscape character as we've identified it. It's an area where some existing orchard trees are growing, and in my mind, from a landscape point of view, it's a fairly contiguous and obvious extension to that basin into a small area. Given its elevation, it doesn't present any significant, and when I say significant, any sort of noteworthy or things that we need to be concerned about in terms of visual effects. And it reads, and I mentioned that word transition before, and I think that's quite important. It reads as a transition zone between RLA1 and 3, and therefore reads as a very logical or rational part of the development within that area of the landscape. So elevation is important, or lack of elevation. Yes, I acknowledge that it does increase and it does rise up there, but I believe it's associated with that farmland basin landscape. And I think that increase of eight lots compared to what might have been realised under LA3, very hard to appreciate or notice from views beyond the site. Yes, you'd obviously experience that when you're in the site, but you're also experiencing a number of other things with the rural lifestyle development.
Right. Okay. No, thank you for that. And just to recap on the overall rural character, we had a lot of discussions about that at previous hearings, and in terms of the changes that have now been proposed through discussions with residents, what we've essentially got is more open space, or rather larger lots along Rippenvale Road, which definitely would retain the rural character, along those areas. But we have quite an increase in density, if you like, in terms of a greater number of smaller lots in the centre of the site, and in terms of any overall appreciation of rural character, other than Rippenvale Road, how would you assess that in terms of the increases in density in other parts of the site? Is that all to do with visibility, points where it can be seen from? There's not so much moving up the slopes other than the 8 lots we've just talked about. Is that the answer to that
Yes,
concern about rural character?
Yeah, quite simply it is. I think it's, as you've mentioned, you've got increase of rural character and amenity with LA6 adjacent to Rippenvale Road. You've got a consolidation of the smaller lots within the landscape that can absorb that.
Right. Thank you. That's fine. That's the only questions I had of that structure plan. Thank you.
In terms of the visuals and the talking through the structure plan, I don't have anything more to add to those, and I'm available for any further questions you might have.
Okay. The only other question I had, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind me butting in, was I think Mr. Whitney made the point at his paragraph 5.3 about nighttime lighting, about I think from Mr. Mackay's viewpoint, I don't recall which one that was, I think it was 14, that there'll be an isolated island of light in that gully, in the lower gully, which is possibly, I think his comment might be more directed at the additional units or additional development that's now proposed in that area. Is nighttime light an effect that we should take account of, do you think, in this context?
Yeah, I do recall the island of light comment. Certainly, yes, and it is something that I addressed in my evidence in chief, and there is a rule about lighting as well that would certainly assist in the mitigation of those effects. And I think one must also remember that lighting is something that also at the start of any development is more apparent, and then as that landscape matures, certainly, I was going to use the word subsides, but it doesn't, it lessens, I suppose. But yes, that is certainly an effect, but I think that the rule package effectively deals with that as well.
Okay, so the rule on lighting is to do with street lighting mainly, isn't it, I think? And
there was a rule also regarding lighting on lots in terms of heights above ground and downward lighting.
Yes, that's right. Okay. All right. What we haven't discussed, and you did provide evidence on the visual effects of tracking and roads and so forth. And
Yes.
I did read that. I didn't have any particular questions on that, but I think Mr. Espy has basically concurred with your evidence on that. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
In terms of the visual effects, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind just recapping on what the key points you made were there in relation to the visual effects of tracking and roads infrastructure.
Yes, sure. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you.
My comments were split into two. First was a discussion around the effects of the road as shown on the structure plan or the construction of that road, and then any future roading. And I based that on the roading layout as shown on that indicative master plan. And then further to that, broke that down in terms of effects during construction and I suppose immediate effects associated with the road, and came to the conclusion that the construction effects of the road would be low to moderate for the one on for the structure plan road, and then in time the lessen to low to very low as that is cut and filled, that is a vegetated and roadside planting takes effect. And then any roading associated with the further development of the site, i.e. the roads we'd shown on the indicative master plan, that at times of construction, the roads on the higher slopes, so in the East Gully, primarily the higher slopes of the East Gully, those effects during construction would trend moderate to high. However, once again fill and cut, that is revegetated and street and roadside planting takes effect, they would lessen to low. And Mr. Espy agreed with that, or concurred with that. He also did add the comment that one needs to also take into account the effects of development associated with the road on the east slope, or East Gully, I should say, as afforded by LA4, and one must consider that at the same time when considering the effects of the roading.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. And I think you also made the point that when subdivisions are, when the land is, if this plan change goes ahead, is developed, there'd be a process for assessing the impacts of roads as part of a development.
That is part of the consenting.
Yep. Yeah, no, look, that's fine. Thank you for recapping on that. I've got no further questions, Mr. Chair, of Mr. Milne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just can I go back quickly to the street lighting, the lighting issue, and understand that there are rules around street outside lighting. I guess the one that's not covered will always be the lighting from the houses. I guess if people choose to screen that lighting from the houses or not, and I suspect that's more the issue that I suspect that Mr. Mackay might have been concerned about.
Right. Yeah, it's a very tough one to deal with in terms of internal lighting. And I suppose I go back to my comment to Commissioner Ray in regards of as the landscape matures. Obviously, people aren't going to have planting right around their house because they'll be building in places where they also enjoy a view. But what you do see is you will see light filtered through vegetation in time as well. So that certainly assists.
Yeah, you're right. I was probably forlornly hoping that you might have said, but I have got a solution for you about that.
No, I don't actually at this stage. Well, I mean, one fight. Yeah, I don't. You often find, and with houses with slightly larger eaves and things like that, it all helps in the mitigation of the projection of internal light. And there, and double glazing, and some people might choose to run with a slight tint in their windows. I don't know, but there's a number of things that actually do add up that help mitigate effects of light over time. So.
I've got no other questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been very helpful, and I won't say that I've got it totally clear, but
Well, I hope I've aided in some part.
no, you had. No, thank you. We had. Appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps just if I can clarify as well by reference to one of the plan rules. So I'm in the standards at 4.7.6. And clause O provides exterior lighting. Exterior lighting on buildings should be fixed no higher than 1 metre above finished ground level, capped, filtered or pointed downwards and screened so as to reduce lux spill. There should be no lighting of vehicle access ways within any sites. So I guess that still doesn't deal to the fact that people might have lights on inside and curtains open, but deals with the exterior lighting.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess I wasn't expecting someone would say we can solve the interior issue as well, because it's always going to be there no matter what.
Okay, the next witness for the proponent is Reese Hill. I can see that he's online, so I'll just get him to get his camera and mute volume working. There he is. Now I understand that Mr. Hill is intending just to take you through his conclusions by way of summary and make some additional comments in terms of the whole NZ evidence, and will otherwise be in your hands regarding any questions that you have.
Welcome, Mr. Hill. Thank you. Yes, and I think that's a good way to start, and we'll pick up any questions along the way. I've now got your piece of evidence in front of me, so thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Commissioners, for the opportunity too. Obviously, my folders. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. Just checking that.
Yes. Yes.
My ring binder is a lot smaller than others, having come into this quite late in the piece. So yeah, I'll start off by just reading through my conclusions and maybe adding a few points and brief around there. And if you have any questions as I go along, maybe pick them up.
Okay.
So based on my assessment of the available soil map information, I concluded that the best soil map information was that provided by Leamy and Saunders 1967, which was the same conclusion that was drawn by Mr. Gibson as well in his evidence. However, as with the land use capability information, which I also found the 1/50,000 scale LUC map was the most useful or most available and useful, they have limitations, and those are really stem around scale and the accuracy of those boundaries and the identification of some of the units on a property scale. So at a property scale assessment of the soils, an LUC could confirm the soils and these LUC classes more accurately and delineate the boundaries. However, the general soil LUC classes, map units and modified soil areas are likely to change a little bit over the area, but probably not in a greater sense, i.e. that means that the map units are probably close to what is on site. I did do an assessment of those of the soil map and using some up-to-date or more detailed slope of information available. I think that's presented in Appendix 6 from memory of my evidence, and that just allowed me to refine some of those boundaries and identify that probably around 5 hectares is likely to be different in terms of the weighing of 5 W5 and soil, and possibly some of the W3 as well. That's mostly around the hill slope. So based on the, moving on to the Macintosh, based on the Macintosh classification for high class soils, the Wyinga W5 and 3 and the Rippenvale R3 soils are classified as high class soils. However, I consider the criteria for soil depth and climate to be too broad or broader and inconsistent with national criteria now provided through the LUC handbook. And the main points there to note are that around soil, the criteria for soil depth, and also around climate, namely the absence of any consideration of frost and lower growing degree day requirements. Under other classifications, the soils on the site would not be considered high-class soils due to soil and climate limitations reducing their capability to be used intensively to produce a wide variety of plants, including horticultural crops. Again, in my evidence, I did provide a number of examples of other classifications used around the country in other regions. It wasn't my intent to discredit the current RPS definition at all, but to provide a bit more information that allowed me to assess whether the range of crops could be limited by climate and other factors. So based on the high class soils definition provided in the operative regional policy statement, the soils on the site do not meet the criteria for high class soils, as both soil and climate limitations restrict the capability of the site to grow a wide range of plants, including the horticulture and arable crops. In this sense, my assessment of the data led me to see that the range of crops, and this has to be a wide range of crops, horticulture in the sense of how McIntosh has included it, he separates out arable horticulture and non-arable horticulture, which I take to mean horticulture or cropping really that requires cultivation, and that's kind of fixed row like we get in orchards and vineyards, etc. Based on my assessment against the proposed regional policies statement, significant soil criteria A through to E, I didn't consider the site in question to be significant soils because they failed to meet the requirements of A, C, and D, and there was doubt around meeting B and E, and this was a little bit difficult to assess in the sense of not a lot of objective soil things, parameters to go on here, but I can discuss that in more detail if you wish. Based on my interpretation of the soil information for land use suitability provided by Hewitt, 1978, none of the soils were identified as high for orchards, cropping and food production. This was, I included this because it was another example, just to give you some more information about other classifications used in the area, not to discredit that again of LEMI, but to it did actually align quite closely with LEMI, so it wasn't an issue. Viticulture on the whole is most suited to soils that would not be considered high class soils. So, and these can include LUC classes, land use capability classes 4S to 7S, basically gravels, and it does not indicate the presence of high class soils. So what I'm saying here is that the viticulture isn't, because of the presence of viticulture doesn't indicate the presence of high class soils necessarily. They can grow on a range of soils. Generally, they will grow on a range of soils that are of less fertility and shallower. A high-class soil should be considered on a regional national basis, and suitability for intensive agricultural cropping is part of soil being considered as high-class soil. And this was identified as well in Lynn's evidence, or Lynn's report, where he stated that the soil should be up to 1 metre deep, I think. And also Alan Palmer in his evidence, which is in my evidence for the one plan, he identified high-class soils as requiring a soil depth of 0.75 of fine soil material. Defining high-class soils based on highly productive does not consider versatility for a range of intensive uses, and that's kind of a key component of high-class soils, is having the soils being able to be capable of supporting or producing a wide range of crops without limitations or with minimal limitations or management interventions. Although some of the soils on the site in question are capable of supporting 1 or 2 highly productive horticultural crops, and that's, for example, the cherries and the viticulture which has been planted, their inherent soil and climate limitations are likely to restrict their capability to support a wider range of crops and horticulture purposes. So in my opinion, the revised structure plan has identified the soil areas where horticulture and viticulture are most suitable, given the limitations of the soil and climate, as well as considering the areas that I identified as modified soil, which disrupt the ability to utilise that land. And in fact, those soils are no longer seen as high-class soils anyway. I have that in my appendix. I think that's an appendix. I'll have a quick look for you. That's appendix 6, so the slope map must be appendix 5, sorry. I'll probably just leave it there, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Sorry, I'm just trying to go into your appendix and just realise that. Commissioner Ray, I know you've got some questions in this area.
Yeah,
follow-ups to that is what I'd like to do. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Hill. Yeah, there was some debate or discussion about whether we should accept your evidence into the process, and we've dealt with that in terms of minutes to parties and so forth. But yeah, I would just like to say that I think this evidence is useful, at least in providing a framework for others to comment on, really, because we haven't got a joint witness statement or a statement that shows us whether the experts agree or disagree in various factual matters. In particular, your statement has elicited a response from several witnesses along those lines. So thank you for doing that, and it has assisted us. Just in relation to the your paragraph 13, this is where you set out the evidence you've had regard to or you've looked at. I just wanted to clarify whether you've seen the section 42A supplementary report. That's Mr. Whitney's latest report. And the reason I'm going to ask you that is I wondered whether you would agree with his factual analysis of the soil types on the site and how many hectares there are of each type. And this is just to let you know, it's at the bottom of his page 9 and top of page 10 of his supplementary statement. I just wanted to be clear that we have some agreement on those matters. If you don't have that in front of you, that's fine. We can come back to it. But
don't actually, sorry.
No, that's all right. So I think it's Mr. Gibson has identified 32 hectares of Wainga fine sandy loam, W5 soils, outside of the cherry orchard expansion in the horticulture area, and therefore in the RURA5 area. So that was something I wanted to have clarified, whether there's agreement on that figure, 32 hectares. And the RLA 6 area would include 13.7 hectares of that, and I think that's been agreed. And 18.3 hectares of W5 soils are therefore present within the 5 area beyond the RLA 6. So there's another 18 hectares there. I just wondered if at some stage we could have agreement on the matters raised in Mr. Whitney's report on those factual matters, just so we understand exactly where the soils are and how many hectares there are of each of those.
Yes, that should be possible.
Okay.
I probably can refer back to my original assessment and look at see what numbers I can come up with there.
All right, and the other thing was that Ms. Wharf, the planner for Hortenshead, the consultant planner, pointed out that you hadn't referred to her evidence in that list. Do you recall having read Ms. Wharf's evidence, which mainly related to RPS and policy statements type things?
Yes, I'm pretty sure I read through her evidence. I didn't see any points that directly or specifically related to the soils that are areas I was covering, that's all.
No, there was a lot of discussion, though, on the definitions and what those definitions mean in the context of this plan change. Particularly some of the points you've made about another question I was going to ask you, specialty crops versus mainstream crops, and what the significance of those words might be in the context of the policy documents. So just to recap on that one, in your view, the specialty crops are the cherries and the grapes. Is that right? In this context, it's cherries and grapes. And I think Mr. Gibson's point, and also made by Ms. Wharf, was that they're really mainstream crops in the context of Central Otago, and a lot of inferences were drawn on how important that is in terms of the policy, the RPS. So can you just recap on that?
Yeah, my interpretation of that is probably from a more of a regional perspective, in that I would still consider them specialist crops mainly because they are quite reliant on specific climate as opposed to soils. Now, I think when I looked at the distribution of viticulture across within the Cromwell area, it wasn't specific to one particular soil, and that led me to believe, and I think also Mr. Gibson raised this point around Pinot Noir, was that it requires specific climate conditions and that's why I put it in the specialist crops, even though it's mainstream within the parts of the region. Those conditions like climate are going to be favourable for those specialist crops, and the same for cherries, I imagine. I'm not familiar with the whole of region and where cherries are grown, but seem to be mostly in Cromwell. But at the same time, though, those climatic conditions, irrespective of the soil, are going to limit the growth of other horticulture and other arable cropping, intensive veggie growing and things like that. So that was my interpretation.
Can I just tease it out a little bit, please? Because I think you could look at it and go, if all of a sudden nectarines became the crop to have, as it was in the 80s, and when you go and look at Cromwell's big fruit statue and go, there's an apple, there's a pear, there's an apricot, and the other one that escapes mine. But so nectarines were seen to be the big crop of the future. The market said different. So I guess what I'm saying is that to turn around and make the cherries the specialty crop, when in fact it's the crop of choice because that's what the market wants, that could change to be some new fruit that we don't know. And so you're looking at the specialty side of things, and you'd say, well, maybe it's the type of cherry that's a specialty that's suitable to particular areas. But again, isn't the market actually driving those things as opposed to the soils or the climate, really? They're factors, I agree, but at the end of the day, well, I don't know what the next best thing's going to be.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point. And in fact, if you'd gone back X number of years, cherries wouldn't have probably been as big as they are, that's for sure, and there would have been a lot more summer fruit. I kind of see the summer fruit and cherries kind of all as one kind of specialist crop, if you like, i.e. summer fruit, requiring a specific climate, which is provided by the Central Otago, and especially around Cromwell. And the same with the Pinot Noir grapes, predominantly Pinot Noir grapes and viticulture. You don't get much viticulture up in the Waikato, mainly because the climate's not so good. It's a bit damp, but you get quite a lot of dairy. But yeah, so that's how I kind of view them as specialist crops, as opposed to a wide or versatile range of crops, including the likes of intensive vegetables, etc.
It's probably semantics on the word specialist, I guess, and it's range of views, and the reality is none of them are wrong. It depends on how you want to interpret it. And but I take your point that the climate has a bearing on no matter what we do, and even about where we live at the end of the day. So yeah, no, thank you. My curiosity is satisfied.
Thank you.
Just one other question, I think, if I can ask that now, just in terms of frost-free days and the restrictions brought about by that part of the climate, Mr. Gibson attached a figure to I think it was Appendix 2 to the back of his statement, which I think he took from the district plan figure 2.4, which shows that the Plan Change 14 site is somewhere in the middle range, I guess, in terms of susceptibility to frost. Did you consider that, Mr. Hill, and do you still consider that frost is a limiting factor for the high class soil or definitions?
Right. Yeah. So the reason I looked at frost was based on the LUC handbook, which provides some guidance, but it's very broad. The Grow Otago information is provided in Appendix 1 of Mr. Gibson's rebuttal evidence is what I used as well. It's in my evidence in the appendix. The general level of frost-free days is seen as a minimum requirement of 200, and the Cromwell or the site itself sits just below that. So it's somewhere in the 180 to 200 range. And then that's why I ended up with drawing my conclusions that it was actually below the site. I also note that in Mr. Edwards' evidence, he kind of sees frost as a high impact factor in terms of determining whether horticulture can be present on the site, as opposed to soils, in fact, which is he assesses as a low impact.
I see. That's right.
It's an agreement with myself. Yes.
Okay.
Interesting that no one actually picked on the biggest one, which is rain.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the other thing. I guess with the using the land use capability, it provides some kind of objective criteria on which to rank the soils in a relative sense. And definitely the shallow soils in combination with low rainfall provide quite a strong limitation in terms of soil moisture deficit in the soils on the site.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing about rain that I had in mind when I made that comment was once the crop is grown and it rains, if you get through the frosts, don't worry, your pain's not finished yet, because the rain might do something that you don't want as well.
Yeah, good point.
So I guess the climate is the key thing that has a lot of influences no matter what, and whether it's frost or rainfall, that has an effect on the crop that is growing ultimately, and doesn't know what your crop is, I guess. Yeah, I have nothing else to ask other than saying that between the various experts who have presented evidence on soils, I'm not sure I had a true handle on who's right and who's wrong. I guess they're all views of the same thing, and it's a very complex matter, and clearly as part of our decision-making process going through, it's one we were going to try and come to some views ourselves. And all I can say is that we are lucky that we've had some good evidence presented to us, and we have the task of having to try and work that through to work out well, not necessarily what we favour, but what we can understand and use to help our decisions. So thank you for that.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Everly.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. So the last witness for the proponent is Mr. Giddens. I can see he's online there. Mr. Giddens will take through some key points from his supplementary evidence and then respond to any questions that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, you're good, thanks.
Perfect. So I'll just run through just the key points in my supplementary evidence and just add some commentary as I run through, and just please stop me if you've got any questions that I can elaborate on. Just at my paragraph 6, I just overview what my evidence will cover, which is overview of the Mender proposal, the identification and evaluation of the key issues raised in Mr. Whitney's supplementary 42A report, which includes my re-evaluation of the key policies relating to those amendments, and obviously my concluding comments. In regard to the amended proposal, I trust you're all familiar enough with that now, hearing from some of the other witnesses and reading Ms. Everly's memorandum, so I won't repeat that. At my paragraph 8, I do note some outcomes which are relatively notable from the amended proposal, which are that 72.9 hectares of the 244 site will remain set aside from rural living as part of the ONL, and of that 171 hectares of the property that's outside of the ONL, 29 hectares of that is to be established for commercial horticulture by New Zealand Cherry Corp. The refined proposal enables a further 13.7 hectares of land for productive uses in RLA 6, and I'd just like to make one correction in my evidence there. At 8C, I refer to RLA 5 and 6. If we can just strike out 5, that's an error there. Oh. And that brings the total area of dedicated productive land to 42.7 hectares. And I can't remember which commissioner had a query just regarding the responsible residents for responsible development. When we went through those amendments relating to RLA 6, one of the requests from them was to try and ensure that that new additional area could be practically used for more commercial uses. And when you see Mr. Milne's indicative structure plan, you'll see that area flows on essentially from the horticulture block. So there was a method to the madness behind that. So I think that's quite another key distinction that's probably been made in the amended proposal versus where we left off in the previous hearing that I just want to elaborate on.
You if you don't mind, Mr. Giddens, I'll ask you questions as we go, if you don't mind, because I've written them down in relation to your paragraph numbers. Just on that, I just had a small question, I guess. Dedicated productive land. What does that actually mean? Does that mean land that can only be used for productive activity, or land that will be used for productive activity?
Yeah, I should probably clarify that, sir. Yeah. I think probably more correctly, it's land set aside for productive uses, because I think the horticulture block itself, one of the key distinctions with that, which I touch on further in my evidence, is that it is part of PC14, and there is a trigger to require that to be developed and used. Yes. It's quite a big distinction from just a piece of rural land somewhere else in the district that may well have significant soils. There's a trigger point here. There's no distinctive trigger point for the 13.7 hectares of land. So that's probably the distinction between the two. But through the planning provisions, it's set aside. So I'll view that as an enablement, essentially.
Because there was some discussion about whether that might be used for grazing, for instance, or it's still a productive use. But I think that discussion might have come back to the visual effects of how it might be used. There was discussion about if it was planted or it would provide a softening of the development behind it. But one of the experts, it might have been Mr. Whitney, said that that may not be the case if it's used for, say, grazing or something that's low intensity. But I guess the key point you're making is that it's set aside. It can only be used for productive use.
Correct.
Is that the key point?
Yeah, it is the key point, and I can probably elaborate on that further. When you look at the national planning standards, there's a definition, and I've referred to it in my evidence. It's I think it's a productive. I'll just make sure I get the terminology right. Primary production. That's the definition that's at my paragraph 21. And the interesting thing about that, it actually refers to aquaculture, agriculture, pastoral, horticultural, mining, quarrying, and forestry activities. So agricultural activity arguably is grazing. So under those national planning standards, it just comes back down to the, I guess, the end use. It is quite broad.
Thank you.
Great, and if I just jump to paragraph 12, just in regard to the scope of the amendments, the only comment I've made there that Mr. Whitney and I are in agreement that the scope of the amendments are within the scope of the notified PC14.
One question, sorry to interrupt. Paragraph 9, the purpose of the proposal. That's what you quoted there as the purpose as in the original documents, I presume. Does that need to be amended in any way to take account of the latest iteration or the latest changes to the plan, the 29 hectares?
I did put some thought to that, sir, and especially in terms of looking at the numbers, but the way it's written, and if I just jump to the point where it says, and facilitate use of a further approximately 29 hectares of land for horticultural development, that captures the horticulture block. And I think when you look at the rest of the word in there, in terms of like avoiding potential adverse effects on the soil resource and the like, I think it's sufficiently broad enough to still have that enablement of that 13.7 hectares of land as well, plus promote the balance of the other sites to be used for horticultural or agriculture use as well.
Okay, thank you. That's fine.
From paragraphs 15 to 27, I have some discussion there on the issue of lot sizes and discuss national planning standards. I have concluded that the definition of rural lifestyle in the national planning standards is the relevant fit for PC14 and not large lot residential, and that's a point of contention between myself and Mr. Whitney. I will note that Ms. Wolf for Hort NZ also shares the same view as Mr. Whitney in regard to the PC14 not being rural lifestyle, but I do think there's quite a big distinction between how Ms. Wolf and I have looked at the definitions. I feel that Ms. Wolf's dissected the definitions a bit too much to piece together that conclusion. And I think the other bit that I think is missing is that she hasn't examined the actual definition of large lot residential under the national planning standards, which is defined as well. So that section of my evidence, I'm happy to go through any questions there if you've had any, sir.
Yeah, I've got one. Sorry, you just in paragraph 18, you make the distinction of you need to look in the context of Plan Change 14 as a whole. So when we're considering primary production, whether it's enabling primary production to occur, the quote above, and then looking at this proposal as a whole, you make the point that it still achieves that. But is it not true that the greater area of the PC14 site is not being used for production? So that even if you were to look at it as a whole, it's still not achieving that, is it? I'm just putting that as a point for you to discuss. Yeah.
You know, I think there's two components to that, because the definition says areas used predominantly for a residential lifestyle, and I've viewed that as being the predominant activity of the zone, and the catch to it is that while still enabling primary production to occur, it doesn't actually. It's quite interesting. It doesn't actually quantify the extent of that primary production to occur, but when you actually balance the 29 hectares of the horticulture block plus the 13 odd hectares from the amended proposal, that's roughly 25% of the plan change area.
I see.
So it is actually quite sizable in that context. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I understand that now. I think you're putting emphasis on the word predominantly residential lifestyle, and the enabling primary production to occur. Your take on that is that it doesn't apply to every lot. It applies to the land when you consider it as a whole. It's still enabling that to occur, but it certainly doesn't happen on every lot.
Yeah, and that's right. And
Yes.
I think there's a bit of balance between myself and Mr. Milne, I think, from a landscape perspective, because when you look at the amended proposal, he has advanced a more clustered zone in terms of there are a lot more open spaces now with smaller lots, which is obviously an issue with Mr. Whitney and Ms. Wharf. But on balance, when you look at it as a zone, I think it is achieving that definition.
Yes, I understand that point. Thank you.
Mr. Gibbons, this might not be a fair question of you, but when you look at Mr. Milne's visual simulation, I would say that if you're not a planner or a landscape person, you'd look at that and go, well, not what I'm looking at. I can see some productive horticultural use in terms of the 29 hectares and the 13, and otherwise I can see a rural lifestyle. I just, the layperson may not see it in the same terms as what a planner or a landscape professional would.
I think the difficulty there is two components to it. There's the landscape component, which is Mr. Milne's addressed, and then there's the productive land component. And I think no criticism of Mr. Milne, but some of the viewpoints probably are geared towards assessing the landscape effects rather than showing the extent of productive or potential productive use of that land as well. So I think you need to look at it with both those matters in mind.
Yeah, and both eyes open.
That's right.
And one eye sees, the left eye sees a whole lot of, and the right eye sees something different. Mr. Whitworth, I think you confirm what I thought.
And sorry, just paragraph 22. Have you got up to that one yet?
I was just about to discuss.
Just about to talk about that. Sorry, I'll let you discuss it, and then I'll ask a question if I need to. Yep.
Yeah, 22 I find quite interesting, and it's where I make the distinction that the definition doesn't actually make a distinction, between commercial productive uses and hobby scale productive uses in terms of primary production. And it's quite an interesting concept, because I think that's probably a difference between Mr. Whitney and myself in terms of how we've viewed the National Planning Standard. And when you actually take that into the regional policy statement, some of those policies are actually quite similar. They don't make a distinction. There are, I believe, a couple in the operative RPS which do refer to economic production, but on the whole, the rest of them don't make that distinction. So I'm happy to answer any questions on that.
Yeah, I was just wondering how, the National Planning Standards, what is their intent in relation to production? You're correct in saying that A to D doesn't differentiate between hobby farming and more productive, more intensive production, but is that likely to be something that they would distinguish under the National Planning Standards? Is it in terms of primary production?
No, I don't think so. It probably actually comes back to my discussion on the zone and how that needs to be read as a whole. Because if you've got the rural lifestyle zone and applying that definition like I have, I've basically taken the view from my reading of this that you can have open areas and productive and larger productive lots, but equally you can have smaller lots within that. So across the zone, there will be a balance of commercial users and hobby users, and I think that's just inevitable with a zone like this.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I do. At 23, I'd just like to stress one point, and you've actually touched on it. Both commissioners have actually touched on this already. I have, throughout my evidence and also in my policy assessment, put quite a lot of importance on the 29 hectare horticulture block. It has been a feature in a lot of my assessment and how I've been evaluating things. I do struggle a little bit with Mr. Whitney's and Ms. Wolf's view, where they've really downplayed any type of importance with the productive land that's been incorporated into PC14, and I find that a little bit contradictory to the views that these soils under the PC14 site are significant. If they were significant, I thought that, or my thinking would be that you would be taking greater stock of those productive uses that are proposed as part of 14. And I just find that a little bit contradictory in terms of where we sit, because PC14 does have a trigger for that horticultural block to be developed and used. And it's quite a fundamental point in my mind.
Right, I see. So just going, I understand that, thank you. But just going to the wider point of whether this can be replicated, your last sentence there, it'd be difficult to replicate this in most cases. I was just curious about what you meant there. Does that mean that there are no other horticultural blocks of this, of the scale that wouldn't have the same circumstances, where a more residential type development could be promoted to tack on to that existing horticultural block? Are there no other situations like that? I'm
not familiar of any, but I think aside from that, the most distinguishing feature is the fact that the proponent is New Zealand Cherry Corp, which is a company that has already large, significant horticultural cherry holdings next door to the application site, which in the proposal, because New Zealand Cherry Corp is incorporating that expansion into the PC14 site, I wouldn't say would it be impossible to replicate, but it'd be extremely difficult. And I think, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. In my view, it's quite a unique component.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
And I probably think to the other point on that, sir, is that there's an economic consideration that would have to be weighed into it as well. For someone to replicate it, I'd have to ensure that expansion or establishment of the horticulture use would be economic.
Yes. Okay.
The mix.
Thanks.
At 28 onwards, so I just touch on reverse sensitivity, and I just will note there that I do comment on that in regard to the amended proposal. So for completeness, I note that my opinions have not diverged from what I've expressed in previous evidence there. I'm quite firm in the view that the policies and the proposed rules do provide good safeguards in terms of managing and also avoiding reverse sensitivity effects. But I don't think anything's changed from that, other than actually making the situation better for the likes of Rockburn by moving development further away from that boundary.
Right, so that's quite an important point, isn't it? Because the changes that have been promoted now are to protect, if you like, the adjacent rural activities, but the point made by Horty and Zed is that you're moving that potential effect inland, if you like, into your own site. But that's not necessarily a concern of Horty and Zed, as I understand it. They're more concerned with the existing operators in the area. But your evidence is that in any event you've got that covered.
Yeah, I find with reverse sensitivity, it's easy to throw stones on the issue. There's from day one with this request, there's been a density of 160 or up to 160 allotments included within the proposal, and that hasn't changed. So it's more of a condensing of the development within the site, and any internal effects in terms of reverse sensitivity on the horticulture block or the front block along Ripponvale Road, for argument's sake, I think that's just a management issue that would be dealt with New Zealand Cherry Corp. Again, it's quite unique because New Zealand Cherry Corp are going to be owning and running that additional block. So I would expect covenants to be in place on that if that was a concern.
I see. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
From 32, I discussed the pedestrian cycle underpass, and I note that Mr. Whitney and I are in agreement in terms of the amended provisions to provide for that. And I understand Ms. McMinn from NZTA is going to be presenting a brief shortly after myself, but that NZTA are now supportive of the proposed measures to address traffic safety and provide that connection through to Cromwell. So there's not much more I can really add to that point now.
So just to confirm, I was a bit confused when I read the various statements on that. Just to confirm, the proponent here is accepting an underpass at the 51st lot. Is that right?
Yes,
as the solution?
yes, correct.
So there's no disagreement with Ms. McMinn on that point. You're accepting that point. Okay. All right. Yes. No. Got it. Thank you.
From 35, I touched on the landscape and visual amenity fix, and you've heard from Mr. Milne, so I don't think there's any need for me to further elaborate on those unless there's any questions.
No, I think I probably had my one about that.
Yeah. So just to recap on that, Mr. Gibbons, you're accepting, or you're relying on Mr. Milne's evidence that the number of lots hasn't changed, and there's some changes in the lower density, I guess, along Ripponvale Road, but there's an increase in density elsewhere on the site, in the central parts of the site, and also some increase on the lower slopes. But overall, the effects on rural character are minor, or at least are consistent with your earlier evidence.
Yes, that's correct. And you know, as Mr. Milne's touched on, there is some intensification essentially within the site, but yes, on balance, I'm happy that my conclusions still remain as per my evidence in chief.
All right, thank you.
From 43, I discussed the availability of irrigation water, and confirm my opinion at 44 that there is currently the potential to obtain further water, but you'll read at my 48 that I caution that there are risks around this. I'm quite firm in the view that just because water may be available to irrigate some of the land, it doesn't mean that it is available, especially when it's still subject to resource consents. I think probably most people on this Zoom meeting know the uncertainty around the resource consent process at the best of times, and also the uncertainty around water. So that's quite a key point for me. I think there should be some consideration given to it, and particularly given there's 47 odd hectares of land that will need to be irrigated. So there will be a balance there. From 49, I discussed the soils mapping. You've heard from Mr. Hill previously. Is there any questions from a planning perspective that you'd like me to run through on there?
No, I'm happy with that. Thank you. Yep.
Well, that leads me to the regional policy statements from paragraphs 56 through to 81, where I have assessed the revised policies. And probably one broad point I'd like to make on that, just in response to one of Commissioner Gillespie's comments before, in terms of there is a lot of soils evidence, and it is a complicated issue. I myself find it complicating, but soils is one component under the RPS that needs to be evaluated by the commissions. It's not the only component. There's a whole balancing, in my view, of all those issues when forming an overall opinion under the RPS. Soils is important, and I think we've all got to that point that it is important, but it is only one factor, and I just think that's a relevant matter to consider moving forward.
And I agree wholeheartedly. Unfortunately, it's the one where there's the most disagreement.
That's right.
Sorry, disagreement is too strong. Range of views. So it's one matter that because of that is going to take quite a bit of unravelling by us to come to a view on. So.
I think to assist the commission as well. If I find myself when you're in these situations when you've got a lot of conflicting evidence or diverse views, it is actually quite useful to revert back to the policy and see what the policy says to actually direct what is relevant and what isn't relevant and the importance of that. So there was one policy that Ms. Wharf and I had different a different interpretation on. If I can take you to paragraph 73, which is policy 3.2.17, and that's the identification of significant soils.
Yeah.
I'd just like to touch on this quickly, just on the basis of some of the comments from Mr. Hill earlier. The difference between, I think, Ms. Wharf and I and how we've looked at this policy is that she has made a focus based on the evidence of Mr. Gibson on clause B, which is the degree of significance of those soils for primary production. My view is you can't look at this policy in a vacuum. You need to actually look at all the matters, A, B, C, D, and E, evaluate those on the round, and then make a determination on the policy. And the reason I say that is when Ms. Wolf's gone into the genesis of that policy, and I don't actually think that helps because the policy is actually quite clear that you need to use all the following criteria. It's not an or an and. You need to. It's very much an evaluative exercise, and the part that interests me earlier on from Mr. Hill was when he referred to the land use capability criteria, which is not only soils that were like, and I think the example was in response to Commissioner Gillespie when he queried about the effects of rain. So there's other aspects like climate as well. So when you're evaluating, say, for example, clause B, the degree of significance for primary production, you need to evaluate clause A, which is the land use capability component, which is not just soils. So I think when you look at the evidence from Hort NZ, it is isolated to primary production, and I think that's only one component, and actually without evaluating the rest of those matters, you can't form a solid opinion on that policy. And Mr. Hill, in my view, is the only soils expert who has actually looked at each of those matters. So I think there's quite a big distinction there. Is there any questions on that around that policy, Commissioners?
Just 61, the operative RPS, the high class soils definition there.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I was just going to ask you, in terms of relative weighting, operative RPS 1998, how much weight should we give that in terms of the other RPSs and statements? Is there any? Have you given any evidence on weighting of those?
It's a horrible planning situation, to be honest, sir. If I can be blunt, well, we need to give effect to the operative RPS. That's what the RMA directs. It is an old RPS. It has been subject to a lot of change, and I think we're at the mercy of the courts at the moment as to when the new version is going to become the operative RPS. And I think, in my view, sir, I need to revert back to the RMA, and it refers to an operative RPS. So it may be a question perhaps for Ms. Everly to address in terms of the legal side of things.
That's right. I mean, it's certainly an operative RPS, but it's 1998, isn't it? And we've been referred to various other iterations and documents. But I guess my main question, going back to 61, was the question I put earlier to Mr. Hill. The last sentence does not include areas that may be suited to one or two specialist crops, largely due to the climate rather than soil quality. And I'm just wondering that the thrust of that policy, how we apply it to a situation like Cromwell, where the crops in question, I guess viticulture and cherries, are really seen as mainstream crops, and that they might be specialists in the sense that they only grow in some areas, but they are the mainstay of the rural economy in this area, aren't they? So, is it fair to describe them as one or two specialist crops?
Well, I think to go back one step, and I think this is probably a distinction between my opinion and probably that of Hort NZ. The policies are regional policies, and they require regional considerations. They're not district policies. Obviously, the Central Otago District Plan soils policies give effect to these regional policy statement soils policies. But in my view, when you evaluate these, you need to take a regional approach. And I think that's a difference between Mr. Hill and Mr. Gibson as well. Mr. Gibson's been given very good evidence on the local context, and I don't think you can put your blinkers on and ignore the local context by any means. But I think when you evaluate this policy, it's a regional policy. So that's where I think the specialist crop debate really needs to be looked at, and it comes into before when you're saying about if cherries and vines are a mainstream crop in Cromwell, are they a mainstream crop in the region? And yes. Maybe that's a question for Mr. Hill, but I would have understood it to be no.
Okay, and would you accept that from Mr. Gibson's evidence, I think as Appendix 2, he provided a list of crops that are reasonably mainstream in this area, in addition to those two, what you might call more specialist crops. There's what he's saying really is that Plan Change 14 could be used for a wide range of crops in this situation. And is there any real disagreement on that in your mind?
To be honest, sir, it's probably stepping outside my area of expertise there. I have relied on the soils experts because it's I don't profess it to be an area that I'm versed on making determinations on. But I do think probably the relevant thing from a planning perspective is taking that step back and looking at a regional level rather than the district level, and then balancing those policies and that with that mindset.
All right. That's fine. I won't ask any more questions on that. Thank you.
I want to, but I don't want to. I guess I'm just trying to picture just why, when you're looking at a regional policy statement, that the locality or the area you're in doesn't have to inform that, because it just seems almost a little too easy to go, no, you go back to the regional big picture. But the big picture is not relevant to the local area, and I just don't quite see how that you can't do both. You've got to somehow do both. I think that's what you both said, is that you can't have stuff. You've got to do both.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of weight in it, and the reason I hold that view is it's very uncommon to go through the RPS and look at the wording to those policies, and not see the words Otago region referred to almost in every objective and policy. And that's really where I'm getting my direction from. But I do agree with you that you need to have some degree of consideration to the local context. I think to do so would overshoot the point. But when you evaluate that policy in the whole, it has to be in a regional context. And I think that probably comes back more to Commissioner Ray's comments regarding that definition. That definition needs to be looked at on a regional scale, and maybe that's where the specialist crop component is looked in. Because if you look at Gibson's evidence, he is evaluating a specialist crop on the basis of the Cromwell area, whereas the definition is a regional definition again.
Okay, I guess it leaves me with the view saying I wonder if a regional policy statement in some respects doesn't need to be a bit more location focused. Anyway,
and sir, the ORC, I understand, is embarking on their new RPS at the moment, so it may well be. And I think when you look at the proposed MPS and where things are heading, it may well get more specific over time. This goes back to Commissioner Ray's query before. We're dealing with a 1998 document, and it doesn't make life easy in terms of evaluations.
Yep, that's probably enough said. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And that really just leaves me to my last comments there at 82 and 83. Just where I reiterate my opinion is that the amended proposal better achieves and gives effect to the operative RPS and is consistent with the proposed RPS, and that my conclusion remains consistent with what I set out in the request document, and that PC14 will achieve the purpose of the Act. So I'm happy to answer any further questions if they haven't been covered already.
Thank you for that. I just had one question, and it's just to really try to understand a part of your evidence in case I'm missing it. But paragraph 77 through to 80, that block of evidence there, if you like. I've just got to get this straight. You refer in paragraph 77 to some methods put in place as the most appropriate. the methods put in place are the most appropriate to manage these soils, as discussed below in the context of that policy. And then you've given us what the policy is, and then you've said in paragraph 79, as per above, I do not consider that they are significant soils, and therefore this policy is not directly relevant. I couldn't see anywhere where you've discussed what those methods put in place as the most appropriate to manage the soils. So,
yeah, sorry, I'll clarify that. So,
yeah, okay.
And when I refer to managing the soils, I'm talking about the management of the soils across the whole of the PC14 site. So that is the setting aside of the 29 hectares for the horticultural block and the additional 13.7 hectares as part of the amended proposal. So I probably could have been clearer on that point. It's the setting aside of the 13.7 and also the implementation trigger point of the horticulture block, which I'm referring to as the management. So I've considered that in the context of 3.2.18, and it's actually quite interesting when you go through those the clauses of 3.2.18. They are quite fitting in terms of, so if you do have a situation where you have significant soil, these are the things that should be managed, and it doesn't say avoid, it requires management of those, and I think that's quite a key distinction in that policy as well, which enables a degree of flexibility in terms of a situation where you do have significant soils. And I think I mentioned earlier on that it's roughly about 25% of the developable PC14 site area is the area that's been set aside. So I'm quite happy that if there was a conclusion drawn that soils are significant, that the policy under 3.2.18 would be achieved in any case.
Okay, look, I understand that answer, and I haven't managed to take notes on that properly, but I wonder, Ms. Everly, if you can incorporate something on that in your closing right of reply or your closing submissions. I think that they're very important points that Mr. Giddens has just made, and I haven't been able to write them down in time. So it's really just to elaborate on what those management methods are, the setting aside of the 29 hectares and the trigger points. I think they're probably reasonably important points to make.
Yes, we can include that in reply. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I've got no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Ray. Thank you, Mr. Giddens. It's been very helpful, as planning always is.
Thank you very much.
And that completes witnesses for the proponent.
Right.
I can't believe that my timetable says the tea break is at 10:45. It's 10:47. So my understanding is that that Julia McMinn from NZTA is due at 11 o'clock. Is that still the situation, Julia?
Yes, that's correct.
I'm here and listening.
If Julie's listening now, she might be able to.
Oh, I was going to say,
yeah,
I'm not hanging out for a break. If people are happy to keep on going, I'm happy to do that. But if here or not,
can I suggest that Ms. McMinn addresses her point, and then we maybe take a brief break, because I need to have a look at Mr. Whitney's report again before we get to him.
That's what I was going to say. So, Ms. McMinn, if you're happy, we could hear from you now, if you don't mind, and then we will take a break before we come back to hear from Mr. Whitney and Espy.
Yep, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, my evidence has ended up being quite straightforward, because yesterday I received an email, just as Ms. Everly pointed out this morning, saying that they accepted our brief of evidence, which was, or that our conclusion, which was to accept the proponent's offer for an underpass at the 51st lot. So if I point to my conclusion at paragraph 13, you'll see where we've actually stated that we would like a small change to that provision, with taking the words "or a formal crossing point" from that, and that has been agreed to.
Yes.
That's about it then.
That's about it then. Yep.
I don't think I haven't got any questions, Commissioner Ray.
No.
Thank you, Ms. McMinn. Very helpful, and just makes things a little bit easier. One thing ticked off that we can move to one side. So, thank you very much.
Okay, that's easy. Thank you very much.
That we will now adjourn. Can I suggest till It's 10 to, so 5 past 11. Will that work all right, people? Quarter of an hour?
Yes.
So I think the call will stay active. Probably just mute and turn your cameras off, and we'll come back at 11:05.
Thank you.
Thanks. So by my reckoning, it's 11:05, so we can resume. Looks like everybody's there that needs to be there. Before I go over to Mr. Whitney, is there anything, Ms. Everly, you want to say at this point, or all good?
No, nothing further from me at this point, thanks.
Cool, thank you. Mr. Whitney.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'd like to do, please, is that, as you know, we've got Ben Espy also available, and I thought the best course might be for him to appear before you first of all, and for you to ask him any questions on the information that he provided, which is attached to my supplementary Section 42A report. And once you finish with Mr. Espy, then I'll continue, if that's okay with you.
Yep, that makes sense. Mr. Espy, are you happy to do that, please? You might need to unmute yourself. Are you there, Mr. Espy? Oh, yes.
Sorry, yes, here now. Sorry, I was just out of the room there.
So, Mr. Whitney just gave you the hospital pass and said before he speaks, he thought you might want to take us through what you have provided in terms of your supplementary comments that were attached to his supplementary 42A report. Might have some questions for you or not. If you could do that for us, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Yes, well, I sat in this morning and listened to the applicant and listened to Mr. Milne. Yeah, so very briefly, I thought I'd just outline what my input has been. So, first of all, we did a peer review of the Rough and Milne Landscape Assessment Report, and of course that peer review was dated April, which was prior to the hearing. Then I was at the original hearing, and by the end of that hearing, I prepared a response document, which was dated 28th of May. So that was a response to the evidence that was presented at the hearing. And then after the amended information came from the applicant to do with creating that RL6 area and the other changes, I produced a supplementary comment, which was the 20th of August. So probably that supplementary comment is the most up to date and deals with the application as it now is. And briefly going through that supplementary comment and the amended structure plan and what have you, and listening to Mr. Milne this morning, I'm more or less in agreement with Mr. Milne's comments regarding the changes that have been made, the increase in productive land adjacent to Ripponvale Road reduces effects on that immediate Ripponvale Road area in terms of visual amenity and landscape character. I accept the point that Mr. Whitney has made, and I agree with it, that while the provisions require large lots in that new activity area, and they require a certain area to be identified for productive use, the provisions, of course, don't stipulate what the productive use is, and it could equally be haymaking, I suppose, to orcharding or viticulture. So, as Mr. Milne did point out, the master plan and the visualisations that have been prepared depict one potential outcome, but it's not the only potential outcome. So that's worth bearing in mind, I think. Having said that, I more or less agree with Mr. Milne's comments regarding those changes. So to get to the pointy end of my supplementary comment, I guess I'm saying that I'm happy with those changes that have been made. I still wind up at the same basic conclusion, I suppose, that while overall I consider the plan change is logical and appropriate in terms of broad-scale landscape planning, and a lot of the design is appropriate, and a lot of the mitigation measures and so on are appropriate. I do have some tension with the SAL area in that east gully in regard to landscape character and visual amenity effects, particularly coming back to those objectives and policies to do with the open character of hills and ranges. That East Gully area, I think, is particularly sensitive in the SAL area. So I hadn't changed my tune on that. But otherwise, I think the amendments that have been made certainly don't increase effect, and they probably decrease effect.
Thank you, Mr. Espy. Take your point about the SAL area. You might have heard me ask Mr. Milne this morning about choice of viewpoint 14, which he has said is comparable to viewpoint 15. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, well, I accept, yeah, viewpoint 15 is an important viewpoint, and it's probably a well-used viewpoint, or it's at least an indication of an area where a lot of people will view the site from. So it's an important viewpoint, definitely. And I took careful account of not just that viewpoint, but that whole stretch of road there. I suppose my view on the visual simulations is that they're a useful tool, and the view from viewpoint 14 is probably very similar to the view from viewpoint 15. And so in doing my assessment, I don't place ultimate weight on those simulations, really. I use them as a tool, but I make the assessment from the viewpoints myself. So yeah, for a layperson looking at the application, probably a simulation from viewpoint 15 would have been useful, but for me, I consider the effects from viewpoint 15 as much, and probably even more than viewpoint 14. So I didn't need a simulation to do that, I guess, but maybe it would have been helpful.
You've actually just confirmed where I was at. It's the fact that I can visually see it and see it quite regularly. That actually I don't need a visual simulation of 15. I know what I can see. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
You said, and I guess what you're saying, that's a valid observation to make. It's what I can actually see.
Yes. Yep.
But I guess by just having the simulation, it might confirm what it might look like, because I can't quite see what it would look like. That's the only assistance it could have provided, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's probably right. And by having a simulation from that viewpoint, it might have alerted people to think, oh, that's an important viewpoint. Yep.
Well, no, thank you. That's answered my question. Thank you, Commissioner Ray.
Yeah, thank you. That was very clear, Mr. Espy. Just one sort of follow-up question, I guess, in terms of the changes that have been made. You've made the point that along Reconvened Road, the larger lot sizes and the more sort of provides slightly more rural character than was there before, and that's been sort of compensated for by increased density, I guess, in the other parts of the site. And you've referred to the East Gully SAL, so I won't ask you any questions on that. But in terms of the intensification within the site on the flatter areas, that in your view, I think you said that it sort of balances out the other changes that have been made in terms of the overall rural landscape. You said it might even be an improvement. Is that right? Is that how you've sort of weighed those two changes and balanced?
Yeah, I suppose that's correct. Ultimately, there is a weighing up and there is a sort of balancing going on. Yeah. I suppose ultimately it's going to be it's more appropriate to have density in the middle of the site rather than beside Reconvened Road. So that's why I probably say overall I think there has been an improvement. Yeah.
Okay, and just to be clear, the 8 additional smaller sections that are being pushed up the hill, I guess, onto the lower slopes, I was told that they're outside the SAL.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, so are they of any particular concern to you? You've addressed it in your evidence anyway, haven't you? But in terms of an overall wrap-up, are they not of any significance to your assessment?
Well, I suppose they're of significance, but I come back to that point that yes, there will be a bit of an increase in effect in that area, but if we balance that with the other change, I think it's on the side of an improvement rather than making it worse.
And is that related back to the viewpoints discussion about where you can actually see those additional 8?
Well, the viewpoints and also just the landscape character of those productive flats closest to the road.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. All right. Understand that. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Sorry, just as brought one to my attention, is back to the visual simulations, and in viewpoint 12, which shows Mr. Miller described the planting on the road area. I think he said 2 metre high vineyards. the discussion we had earlier today was said that there's no guarantee that it will be vines that are there and it will be any other agricultural use. So I guess if I was to strip away, apart from the amenity planting, well, if that's the right word, along Reconvened Road, it might be quite a different view.
Yeah, that's right. It might be more open. You know, if the productive use that happens on those flats ends up being, you know, haymaking or grazing or something like that, yeah, it would certainly be more open. There's still this separation, I suppose, between the road and the density. And as I understand it, Mr. Milne, in his latest evidence, is suggesting to keep the amenity strip of planting along that part of the site, even though it's got this new activity area applied to it. And I'd agree with that. I think that's certainly worth having there.
Okay. No, thank you. I've got no other questions. Thank you very much. That's been very helpful.
Thank you.
Mr. Whitney.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like you, I acknowledge the fact we've had an awful lot of detailed material over the proceedings, and also that the proposal has changed somewhat, almost forwards and backwards at times through that process. I'm thinking that the best course for me might be to first of all take you through my supplementary section 42A report, talking to it rather than reading it. And I think it would be appropriate for me to talk to you about a few matters raised by Mr. Giddens that I won't have covered off on the basis that Mr. Giddens' evidence and the other evidence of September has come in post my 42A supplementary report. But I'm also very conscious of time and my desire that we can sort of hopefully wrap things up today. So I'll try and be succinct and just draw your attention to things rather than giving you too long a dissertation, if you like.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so if we go to my supplementary report, please, and just notice, and I just want to, again, for the matter of record, section 2.0. So this is my fourth written document that you have from me. They are building blocks, and I think, sadly for you, when you come to your determination or your deliberations, I think you're going to need to read those in sequence, otherwise you could get horribly confused. Just because I haven't said something in my supplementary report, it doesn't mean that I'm not still holding to something I've said in my earlier documents. So I'm just really conscious that you've now got 4 documents to be alert to from me. Page 2, section 3. I just notice under amendments to structure plan, the numbered item 5, of course, now what's happened is we've reverted back. We've gone from deletion back to introduction of the amenity edge Reconvened Road. I just acknowledge that. And also that is essentially where we are. The table below that, on the bottom of that page 2, those are the figures that you asked for this morning, Mr. Chairman, basically the number of lots. And I'd just like to explain that table to you just while you're looking at it. So the total of 152 lots is based on the notified statement from the applicant requester, which was in Ms. Hampson's evidence about the number of lots per RLA. That's where that is 152 comes from. The amended lot yield 139 comes from the indicative master plan, if I recall correctly, tabled by the requester through Mr. Milne, I think, in May. And then the July 2020 version 150 is what we've now currently got before you. And just to state the obvious, the numbers have reduced and then gone up again. And I particularly just note the RLA 1 and 2 are substantially greater in number now than where it was originally proposed, for the reasons that we're aware of, particularly the creation of the RLA 6. I'd also like to reiterate what has already been said to you, I think, by Mr. Giddens and others. That 150 is only one possible outcome. I think from the Commission's point of view, you need to be just simply conscious and alert to the 160 cap, which has now come back into the provisions. It went down to 150, it's now back to 160, so it's the 160 cap, I think, is the key thing for you.
Thank you.
On page 3, amendments to the other PC 14 provisions, I'd just like to notice number 2. You may remember we had a lot of discussion, particularly back in May, about a rule which was going to require that half of the area of the lots was to be used for some productive purposes in the RLA 2, 3 and 4. That's now gone. It's no longer on the table from the requester's point of view. And item 4, it is now pedestrian cycle underpass only, as has been noted with Waka Kotahi and the the requester's comments this morning from Ms. Eppley and Mr. Giddens. So I go now to scope and general assessment, and I hate to keep coming back to this, but here we've got the national planning standards. You've heard a lot of discussion about this, and I just like to read this again to you. Areas used predominantly for a residential lifestyle within a rural environment on lots smaller than those of the general rural and rural production zones, while still enabling primary production to occur. I think the word lots is important. That was emphasised by Ms. Wharf. This is a zone, and it is creating lots of that size. I don't think there's a basis here for sort of some kind of over and under type approach, but I'll take it further. But I concur with Ms. Wharf's reference to the word lots in her latest evidence. So that's relating to the rural lifestyle zone of the national planning standards to the extent that, that they're relevant. Turning now to 4.3 reverse sensitivity.
Sorry, Mr. Whitney, do you mind if I interrupt and just clarify something about that?
No, that's fine. Yeah, please do. Please do.
So are you saying that the area in which Plan Change 14 relates to is largely within the general rural and rural production zones of the current district plan, and the lot size we're talking about is 8 hectares? Is that the inference I should take from what you said?
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. This all goes back to I'll probably touch on this later. It all goes back to the purpose of this plan change, which is all about providing rural lifestyle opportunities, and that's in a nutshell what's there. In an attempt to understand what rural lifestyle means in earlier phases of these hearings, the National Planning Standards description of a rural lifestyle zone has been referred to give you an idea of what is intended to be a rural lifestyle. And that goes back to lots used predominantly for a residential lifestyle while still enabling primary production to occur. Now, just bear in mind here, you're dealing with, for example, 78 lots being created, as I understand it, in the RLA 1 and 2, which have areas of 2,000 to 3,000 square metres. And I think there are, and as I've said to you in earlier documents, I think there's a fundamental question. Is that rural lifestyle, or is it, in fact, in my opinion, large lot residential subdivision?
Okay.
So can I just follow up on that, Mr. Whitney, please? So we had a discussion with Mr. Giddens on that earlier. Are you interpreting that provision to mean that all of the lots within a zone each and every one must be capable of primary production on each of those lots? You're not looking at it as in the whole, you're looking at it per lot.
Yeah, well, we'll just go back to it. It's that particular prescription is talking about a zone. So what I would anticipate that such a zone would provide for would be subdivision based on enabling primary production to occur.
Within the zone?
I believe it would be highly unlikely that such subdivision would be creating lots of 2,000 square metres, half an acre.
Okay, so there's a difference. Okay. That's the key difference between the planning witnesses, isn't it? Really is the emphasis on that. Okay, we'll have to consider that further.
And I'll go further than that, and I just flagged, you will have noticed in Mr. Milne's supplementary or his latest evidence, he has used that word rural lifestyle throughout. That again is an issue I have. based on the size of the lots we're talking about.
Okay.
And just to recap that, and I've already mentioned it to you, in an attempt to overcome that before, in my opinion, the requester suddenly brought in that 50% rule, which is now gone. So you're back to square one as far as that issue goes.
Yes, I understand that. Thank you.
Okay. Page 4, reverse sensitivity, and I've acknowledged the amendments there, but in the second paragraph, I've noted that because of the change now proposed, now made to the structure plan, and this is the one you're now dealing with, an effect of that, or a provision in that, is to bring the RLA1 2,000 square metre lots alongside the horticultural area. So if you, and in fact, it's quite informative if you go through the process of looking right back. If you were to look to the originally notified structure plan, you would have found a portion of RLA1 adjacent to the horticulture area. Then if you were to look at the May version of the structure plan, that had gone, and it was going to be RLA3 and RLA4, which is 4,001 hectare lots adjacent to the horticulture area. And now the latest iterations of the structure plan, we go back to having RLA1, larger in fact than originally notified, with 2,000 square metre lots adjacent to the horticulture area. I believe that in fact does raise significant issues in terms of reverse sensitivity, and that's why I've said in my supplementary, I believe that's a retrograde step in the context of reverse sensitivity.
Yes, and if I can just ask a question on that, I understand that point, Mr. Whitney. You're saying it's a retrograde step internally, if you like, internal to the development, but would you accept that it's a positive step in terms of the external effects? In other words, the existing operators down Reconvened Road would be further separated from the activity. Is that a positive?
Yeah, I think that is.
Yes.
But I'm probably a little concerned about sort of trading off different versions. Oh, there's a little bit of an improvement there, etc.
Yeah,
you are looking at a plan change, whether to release this land from rural resource area to this particular zoning prescription, I think. But I acknowledge the point. I acknowledge that the latest version of the structure plan does provide some additional separation from the existing horticulture at Reconvened. And I also acknowledge, as I've already said in the opening paragraph, that that extra separation provided by the RLA6 will be beneficial for Rockburn Winery.
Yes.
Okay.
But you've evaluated that in the whole and come to the conclusion that it's still a retrograde step overall. Is that your?
Yeah, I still believe we've got, in terms of reverse sensitivity, we've got a retrograde step. All
right. Okay, I understand that. Thank you.
Which will be what the environment which will be experienced by future residents of the RLA1 if this proceeds.
And so just to finally to round that out, so the reverse sensitivity concerns internal to the development, which you've talked about, you don't think they can be appropriately managed through the mitigation offered by the proponent, the internal mitigation?
Well, my understanding is that related to activities, effectively, particularly activities within houses. You still have a real issue about what about use of outdoor areas.
Right.
You will literally have people on 2,000 square metre lots with their children playing and other activities going on of a recreational nature right next to a production orchard. And you've got extensive evidence about that, sprays, noise, etc., which we've already had presented to you by other witnesses earlier on.
Right, okay, that's fine. Thank you. Understand that.
Okay. I think just 4.4, just to acknowledge, I think now we've got a situation where the State Highway 6 crossing factor is now resolved. So there's no point in talking about that further. The 5.2, it's really a traverse of Mr. Esty, and I think you've already covered that with him, so I don't propose to go into that again. 5.3, this is probably more my response, so that's on the landscape, on the visual simulations. I reacted in terms of the aerial viewpoint to Mr. Mellon's statement that, quote, this is not a point from which the site will actually be viewed. Well, what I did in response to that was said, well, actually, it's the end of an airstrip, and there's also a scenic flight flight business in that locality. So clearly it would be viewed from above in that context. And I simply made that statement. I made the comment about the aerial viewpoint and the other visual simulations showing basically dwellings particularly, but not really showing other buildings. Now, I noticed particularly this morning, Mr. Milne made a reference to and it was words to the effect of buildings ancillary to the productive use, particularly of the RLA6. Yeah, buildings associated with productive use are the words are used. Now, if you, for example, look at that picture produced by Mr. Milne, the aerial view shot. Just going to find it. Yes, I have. This is the material that came in July, the aerial shot.
Yep. Yes.
Just if you look at the RLA6 portion, that's the bit adjacent to Ripponvale Road. That appears to me to show 3 houses. I don't see any evidence there of any other buildings that might be associated with the productive use which Mr. Milne anticipates. And I realise this is just a viewpoint as a visual aid, but I don't believe story for built development in our RLA6. And the other point I'd just like to emphasise is, of course, that does show a vineyard over that development rather than anything else, as does the indicative master plan. If you look at the legend of that, it says vineyard for that RLA6. Right, so my point was, this models houses, it doesn't model anything else, and I've focused on the RLA6, but I could also talk about the RLA5, minimum lot size 3 hectares. Again, you'd expect there'd be some barn or something for the tractor or whatever else they're going to use up there. We talked about viewpoint 15. I still believe that's the most important viewpoint because that's of the ones presented, because that's where the most people, members of the public, will view this development from. So I've related to that. I have emphasised, going back to that RLA6, and it's already been touched on, but it's my understanding from looking at the rules that basically that land could be used essentially for a dwelling, curtilage, and the rest of it could simply be left as a paddock, a couple of ponies or a few sheep or whatever else. There's nothing in the plan change 14 suite of provisions that would actually prevent that outcome.
And what's the significance of that, Mr. Whitney, in your?
Well, I go back to things like visual simulation showing vineyards and so on and so forth. There's no guarantee that that would be the outcome.
In terms of, and is that important in terms of the rural character, or is it important in terms?
Well, it does mean that potentially somebody, and I acknowledge the fact that we've now got the amenities stripped back on Ripponvale Road, but if you look between the trees, if you like, as you're going past, you are potentially looking at the RLA1, particularly over a flat open paddock, and if you want to, you'll just simply see a row of houses and whatever else from that perspective at a certain distance, and I acknowledge that.
I see. So the presence of buildings like farm buildings and that sort of thing would help in some way buffer that view into the RLA1. Is that?
It might. It might, but my main point is that you're going to be, you potentially could be looking at it across open land rather than land vegetated by vineyards or orchards or anything else.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yep, thanks.
In terms of my landscape and visual effects conclusion, I realise I'm a planner, not a landscape architect, and I should just simply say, as a planner, I'm used to reading and interpreting documents and coming to my own conclusions. I still think that the raised concentration of housing on the slope, as viewed particularly from the likes of viewpoint 15, I think is going to overall exacerbate the adverse effect of the Plan Change 14 proposal in total from that perspective, which is that public perspective.
And just on that, Mr. Whitney, you've made your point about viewpoint 15 not being included, but do you accept the evidence of others that it'll be a similar view into the site as 14, I think it was? Is it a similar view in, or do you think that the effects will be more dramatic or will be exacerbated by looking at it from 15? Just not clear what your evidence was on that.
Okay. From 15,
yep.
You are looking across the open airstrip and racecourse land.
Yes.
You are looking at a broad landscape that includes the Pisa Mountains ONL,
right.
the hills of the SAL, and at a central point in that view, you are going to be inserting a very substantial number of dwellings, essentially a large lot residential subdivision in that vista.
Okay.
And I think that really needs to be borne carefully in mind. In my opinion as a planner, the incongruity of having such a large lot residential subdivision in that vista.
Right, I understand. Thank you.
Now, the availability of irrigation, I really don't know whether I can help you much about that, but I think we've got, the fundamental for me is the starting point of the requester in these proceedings was you can't irrigate this land. By that, I'm talking about the non-horticultural area land. It's not a goer. I remember Ms Hampson went so far as to say, oh, look, opportunity cost is none because you can't get irrigation water to the land. I think the evidence has come through to you in various ways, has now got you to the point, and I agree with Mr Giddens, that you can get irrigation for this land from multiple sources. The soils mapping side of things, first of all, in terms of the Macintosh work, I go back to what I've already said to you before. My inquiries indicated, in fact confirmed, that the Macintosh work identifying high-class soils fed into the preparation of the operative regional policy statement. I think also those statistics, which has been already touched on by Commissioner Ray, that I've presented there, are derived from Mr Gibson's work. So I've accepted that, and unless I hear to the contrary, I'm comfortable with those figures.
Okay.
And I think the other element, just on the soils, the Leamy and Saunders soil maps, I think are accepted now by not just Mr Gibson, but Mr Hill, and I think Mr Giddens, as being, the best information available with respect to soils. And I go back to what I've said to you earlier. If you look at the Leamy and Saunders soil maps, which was attached to one of my earlier documents, you will find that the only place at Ripon Vale with a large lump of W5 soil is on this site. I'll just move on, because I don't want to extend this any longer than I have to. I'll make comments about other Plan Change 14 amendments. The 476 AP talks about the lighting. Again, we've got a large lot residential subdivision of scale, and the proposal is there's a rule which says you can't have street lighting. I find that quite incredible in terms of issues of safety, etc., etc. And also in terms of lighting, has already been acknowledged, there is control about lighting exterior within lots. There is no control about lighting interior from the dwellings. And it appears to me from the distance you're going to have an island of light associated with activity here, which again will be sitting in an otherwise relatively dark rural vista. National policy statements are just, this is an update really. We've now got an MPS urban development, which came into effect in 2020. That's different from where we were earlier on. So we definitely have a live NPS, urban development, and Mr. Giddens and I are in agreement that's got no particular relevance here because we're not dealing with an urban environment in this locality. I've also reiterated my caution to you about the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land. It's a draft document. I don't believe you should be putting any weight on that at all. So Perhaps now, this is any other specific questions about what I've said so far. Perhaps I can now go back to Mr. Giddens' evidence quite briefly as well. Okay.
Yeah, that works for me. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'll just give you the paragraph numbers. 7C, you've already had a discussion with him about this. He's saying that 13.7 hectares of RLA 6 brings the total area of quite dedicated productive land to 42 hectares. I accept that the horticulture area is dedicated productive land. I don't see that the RLA 6 is. And in fact, it seems to me that from the rules in the plan change perspective, I don't really see a lot of difference between RLA 6 and, for example, RLA 5. My understanding is the rules are essentially the same. So I think dedicated is probably a little bit strong. Paragraph 18, page 5. Again, reference to 42.7 hectares of land to be both used and enable primary production to occur. Again, I think the RLA 6 is not so directed. And then he goes on to say that in his opinion, the definition, that's out of that national planning standard we talked about, needs to be read in the context of PC14 proposal as a whole and not isolated into a consideration of the allotment size as well. 3 of the 150 lots shown on the indicative master plan are in the RLA 6. So then you've got another 147 lots of various sizes, and as I said to you, I think it's about 76 are in the 2,000 to 3,000 square metre range. So I'm still not convinced that, at all that this is rural lifestyle, as is the purpose of the plan change. Again, paragraph 22, that reference to commercial. I'm sure I didn't raise any issues about commercial or whether it's economic or anything. I was simply talking about whether it's rural lifestyle or not. Again, 23, commitment to provide 42.7 hectares for productive uses. Is that a commitment or is it simply an opportunity? And as I said, that opportunity relates to other areas of the site as well, the larger lots. And also in that paragraph, I'm not convinced this is unique. It strikes me that you could well have a piece of land which might have an area particularly suited for horticultural development, and the developer may say, oh, well, let's subdivide the rest, which isn't quite so productive or whatever, for lot sizes, residential lots to fund the horticultural development. I think that could actually happen in other localities. It hasn't happened before that I'm aware of, but it's a possibility in a district such as this where you've got such a mixture of different land types.
So Mr. Whitney, on that one, I did ask a question to Mr. Giddens on that. So you're saying it could happen in terms of a new development, a new horticultural enterprise being developed as a sort of a catalyst for further urban type development. But are there any established horticultural activities that are already there, where somebody could potentially look to do that, to expand into the periphery of that with urban type development?
Not through a plan change urban development that I'm aware of. I'm aware of horticulturalists who may have identified a bit of less productive land on their property and then gone through a resource consent to subdivide it off.
Yeah.
But I'm just nervous about the use. Well, the word unique in planning terms, in my opinion, is a very significant word, and I think that should be used with great care. And I don't know. I'm not satisfied that it's appropriate here.
But we're not considering a non-complying activity. We're not considering a resource. So the precedent or unique circumstance argument doesn't apply quite so to a plan change proposal, does it?
No, but it's been raised by Mr. Gibbons, so I've responded to. But I've given you my opinion. I don't necessarily accept this as unique.
Okay, and I did ask a question on that, so thanks for your response. Thank you.
Okay.
That's
Okay. I'm just now skipping over the bits I've already addressed you on to avoid duplication. Yes, if we can go to page 13, paragraph 50, or commencing at paragraph 58. This is the operative regional policy statement. And just for your reference, if you go back to my original section 42A report on page 76, I discussed that document there. So that's, and I believe you do have to take it into account because you've got a situation where there are certain provisions in the operative regional policy statement which have not yet been superseded by the partially operative or proposed regional policy statement.
right. Okay.
I'd just like to note, in terms of the definition of high-class soils, paragraph 61, and this goes back to the discussion about regional or national perspective or whatever versus local. I just note that in the operative district plan, the term high-class soils is defined. And when you look at that definition, you will find it is not identical, but very similar to the operative regional policy statement definition. So there is a local definition of high-class soils, so don't lose sight of that. And the fact that they're very closely aligned is not surprising, given the operative district plan was notified in 1998 and the regional policy statement became operative in 1998. Now, I'd just like to talk to you about the two specialist crops matter as briefly as I can. This is the point of difference, if you like, between Mr. Hill and Mr. Gibson. I know mention has been made of cherries and vineyards, but I'd just like to draw your attention to paragraph 8.5 of Mr. Gibson's latest evidence, where he's talking about, as I understand it, the W5 soils, the Waianga 5 soils. He says, quote, and it's quite brief, these soils are suitable for a wide range of crop types, including apples, pears, nuts, berries, olives, and summer fruit crops, cherries, apricots, nectarines, peaches, and plums, as well as grapes. As these crops grow successfully in Central Otago and plantings vary across time due to market demands and improvements in plant varieties. So I think you need to bear in mind that the potential crops on this land go way beyond cherries and viticulture, cherries being a particularly significant element in the market at this time.
And Mr. Whitney, he did include, Mr. Gibson did include an appendix to his evidence.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did, and which included all sorts of, I haven't taken you to that, but there's a long list there, including various vegetables, etc. as well, which I thought was interesting.
And can you just remind me, there's a reference that I haven't got at my fingertips to a district plan, a district plan reference to this site or this area, Plan Change 14, as being productive land in some sense. Can you remind me what that was? Does the district plan deal with this site at all specifically?
Not that I can recall. It has dealt with this site in the sense that's included in the rural resource area where you expect to find rural activities.
And just on the frost-free plan that was attached to Mr. Gibson's evidence, he didn't source that, he didn't write the source, but I think he referred to a figure 2.4 in the district plan. Is there a figure 2.4 in the plan that has frost-free?
I think I'll just double check. I think the figure he's talking about, if it's the one I'm thinking about, shows growing degree days.
Okay, all right.
I will check that now for you though.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know whether the district plan has anything in there that might help us.
Well, if you want those references, there is a reference, clause 233 of the district plan talks about soil resources.
Yes, okay.
And then it goes on later than that to special land resources.
That's right, yeah.
Which goes to figure 2.4, which, as I said, shows areas with over 800 and above growing degree days.
That's it. No, you just answered. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. There is a reference to that figure.
Okay.
And they're called special. What was that reference? Soil resources.
It's the next clause, which is under the general heading of soils, is called special land resources.
That's it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. Okay.
So in other words, factors beyond the soil per se.
Very good. Thank you.
Paragraph 63, I just reiterate, Macintosh informed the operative regional policy statement when they were looking for high class soils. Right, so just before I give you my final recommendation, I still retain concerns with respect to Plan Change 14, and I'll probably just put this into 5 brief points. The first one is visual landscape effects, particularly relating to the vista from State Highway 6 across the airfield and racecourse. Next one is the effect on rural character at Reconvened, and by that I mean again an enclave of large lot residential activity at such a scale in that area. The next point is reverse sensitivity effects, particularly reverse sensitivity effects as that will relate to occupiers and their future experience with respect to their horticultural activities, particularly in the locality. The use of highly productive soils, whether you call them high class or not, I still think they are, but anyway, the use of highly productive soils for essentially large lot residential. And I think, as I've indicated, based on Mr. Gibson's figures, we're talking about 18 hectares odd outside the RLA 6. And finally, the lack of integration of that large lot residential area with the existing Cromwell town. And you've had discussion before from me with respect to the Cromwell Master Plan, which has a clear indication that State Highway 6 is effectively the boundary for Cromwell town. So this is not integrated. There may be a connection now provided by way of an underpass, but this large lot residential area is in no way integrated with the residential area of Cromwell. So those are my concerns. As far as recommendations go, I simply confirm my original recommendation that Plan Change 14, that request be declined.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney. Can you just clarify that point 4, please? I didn't quite get that written down.
Well, I was referring there to the use of highly productive soils for essentially large lot residential subdivision. And as an aside, I refer to the 18 hectares, which is based on Mr. Gibson's calculation.
Thank you.
Yep. Just on that last point about integration and connection, Mr. Whitney, what I think you're saying is that the fact that you can get across the highway or under it does not in itself constitute what you'd call integration.
Yes.
I'm just trying to. I think I understand that, but I'm just. What more could the proponent do other than move their site closer to town, and what would that achieve? I'm just trying to understand that.
Well, yes, you're correct. The only way you could achieve true integration for development of this scale is to actually have it adjacent to the existing form of the Cromwell town. This is an isolated piece of land separated by that from that town by, as you know, a highway and orchard properties, etc.
So it
It's
would
simply
be
not integrated.
no, but the crossing point itself would be safe, wouldn't it? Because it goes under the highway. But
Yes.
do you think we should consider more than safety? We should consider ease of access or convenience of location close to a town as part of that integration aspect.
Well, I think, in my opinion, effectively a residential zone, large lot residential zone, which is effectively what this is, should be integrated into the existing urban form of Cromwell.
Okay.
This is very clearly separated, which has all sorts of implications, for a lack of cohesion with that community.
All right, understand that. A final question of Mr. Whitney is, this hearing process has taken some time, and I'm just curious to know whether you're aware of any developments with the master plan, or at least any plan changes that might be promulgated through in terms of providing more housing areas within the Cromwell area. Have there been any developments in that area since this hearing?
I think from my own observation, since this process started in particular, I'm sure at some point you will have heard reference to the Wooing Tree block of land at Cromwell.
Yes.
That was rezoned through a plan change process, plan change 12, I think, from memory. I can say to you now that from my own observation, earthworks are now occurring on that land to create sections, and I know that a subdivision consent's been granted for that land.
Right.
For part of that land, I should say. It's going to be a staged development. In terms of the plan changes from the master plan, yes. I really can't update you further than I have before. I haven't been involved in that.
All right, that's all right. Thank you for that. Understand. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Ray. Thank you, Mr. Whitney. I've got nothing to add either. Okay. And I just making sure I'm not missing anything. On that basis now, I guess it's back to Ms. Everly. Thank you for giving me the hint, confirming what I was thinking. We're now in a situation where a writer reply from the applicant, and I'm sure you're going to give us some verbal reply, but then, as you've indicated already, you're probably going to then reserve to make a full reply in writing. So I'll hand over to you to tell us where to from here, from your point of view, and we may obviously have some questions on that, and we'll clarify what's going to happen next.
Thank you. I actually wasn't intending to provide you with any verbal reply now, really because what I have left to address in reply is quite a number of quite discrete points, and so it's difficult to deal with that comprehensively. Also, because I've had the benefit of making submissions to you on more than one occasion, it means that a number of those points have actually already been sort of resolved through this series of submissions. So at this point, I was just intending to address you in writing.
Yep. Okay. Have you got any idea of your expected time frame? Maybe I'll ask you that first before I give you what I think it might be.
I would propose 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's good. That sounds reasonable, I think. And then clearly, what will take place from there is that Commissioner Ray and I will get into the real deliberations. We can make some start and some headway on some of the stuff, obviously, in terms of bringing together a report. But without that final closing from you, we would be reluctant to go too far down the track. Our intention is to, we're probably working quite good. Today's that's the 5th, that's the 19th. Probably the following week, we would probably earnestly start our deliberations as to how that would work, and go from there. At this stage, I think it's appropriate, and I won't do it just now, but my intention will be to adjourn the hearing. Because clearly your reply may actually bring out some things that might cause us to think, and our deliberations along the way might also give us some further questions, whatever, which we will then address through a minute and take it from there. So I'm not saying that will happen, but I think it's only fair to alert everybody to that possibility either way. Yep. Anything else, Commissioner Ray, that you might add that I haven't forgotten?
No, I think that time frame's good because as you know, I'm doing a hearing in Alexandra in that week of the 22nd or 23rd, around there, and We've made tentative arrangements for you and I to get together while I'm down in that part of the world to start our deliberation. So if Miss Everly can get her right of reply, and within 2 weeks, that'll work out quite nicely for that, I think. Yep. So thank you.
So anything else to add, Ms. Everly?
No, nothing further from me. Thank you.
On that basis, I'll adjourn the hearing with the expected right of reply from the proponent to be with us by the 19th of November, and then deliberations to follow from there. And if we're just going to check with my council support team to make sure procedurally I haven't got anything wrong.
That's good. So, perfect. Thank you.
So I'd just like to thank everybody for all the hard work and for trying to assist us through this process. It's been really useful. We've obviously read some really good information and evidence, so that's been very helpful. Thank you. And with that, wish you an enjoyable rest of the day, and we'll be back in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's going?